A tiny globe of wire resting on the kitchen board, holding all the bitter fragments I usually ignored. I used to drop the broken leaves right into the glass, watching all the messy floating pieces slowly pass. The water turned a muddy shade and clouded up my view, a chaotic sort of morning lacking any honest hue. My thoughts were just a scatter of the things I couldn't say, floating indiscriminate and getting in the way. But you took the little metal sphere and opened up the latch, giving my erratic mind a steady place to catch. You lock the loose ingredients behind the woven mesh, leaving all the water looking innocent and fresh. The boiling heat embraces it without a single trace of dust, a quiet demonstration of an undeniable trust. The bitter leaves are trapped inside a dedicated shell, while only the aroma manages to break the spell. Steep in the gold, pulling out the flavor in the deep, a quiet sort of promise that my tired soul can keep. You take my scattered chaos and you hold it in the dark, filtering the sorrow to produce a steady spark. I do not have to swallow all the mess I used to hold. You keep the rough edges and you give me back the gold. Steep in the gold, pulling out the flavor in the deep, a quiet sort of promise that my tired soul can keep. You take my scattered chaos and you hold it in the dark, filtering the sorrow to produce a steady spark. I do not have to swallow all the mess I used to hold. You keep the rough edges and you give me back the gold. People try to run away from all the bitter parts, ignoring the ingredients inside their weary hearts. But running leaves a hollow cup without a taste to know, a bland and empty journey where the passing hours go. You recognize the value in the broken dried out leaf, extracting a reliable and savory relief. The little chain is hanging on the handle of the mug, a tether I can follow like a steady gentle hug. Dip the silver mesh, watch the water change, sort the honest truth from the wild and strange. The cup is a haven shining in a yellow tone. I sit at the table knowing I am not alone. I realize that loving is a purifying screen, a boundary deciding what is hidden and is seen. You didn't ask to throw my complicated past away. You organize the sorrow so the better parts can stay. I pull the metal sphere and leave it dripping on the tin, embracing the horizon where my better days begin. The tea is rich and flawless in the fading morning light, a quiet preparation for the struggles of the fight. I hold the warm ceramic and I let my shoulders drop, grateful for the filter where the anxious habits stop. Steep in the gold, pulling out the flavor in the deep sea, a quiet sort of promise that my tired soul can keep. You take my scattered chaos and you hold it in the dark, filtering the sorrow to produce a steady spark. The liquid is a remedy that sets my spirit free. I sip the quiet comfort that you manifest for me. The chain rests, the water cools, I am warm. The hardwood floor is freezing when the winter sun is low, a daily introduction to the only chill. I know I used to step upon it with my bare and tired feet, jarring little tremor and a quiet, sad defeat. The oak was unforgiving and the varnish felt like ice demanding I wake up and pay a cold and bitter price. I walked across the living room anticipating pain, a shiver running deeply in my isolated vein. But you laid out a pair of faded fabric by the bed to cushion the reality of where my footsteps tread. The corduroy is ribbed and holding on to all the heat, a dedicated padding for my weary, anxious feet. The memory foam is sunk into the shape of how I stand, a custom-fitted harbor in a very quiet land. The freezing wood is banished by a simple cotton thread. I navigate the morning, walking softly in my head, walking on velvet, hiding from the bitter cold. A story of devotion that will never get too old. You do not let the winter bite the arches of my feet. You line my path with comfort in a quiet, soft retreat. I don't have to brace my body for a sudden jarring shock. I glide across the timber on the early morning walk. Walking on velvet, hiding from the bitter cold. A story of devotion that will never get too old. You do not let the winter bite the arches of my feet. You line my path with comfort in a quiet, soft retreat. I don't have to brace my body for a sudden jarring shock. I glide across the timber on the early morning walk. The outside world demands a heavy leather hiking boot, a hardened set of armor for a complicated route. You tie the laces tight and fight the traffic on the street, accepting all the blisters of an ordinary beat. But crossing my own threshold means the heavy armor falls. I slip into the fabric hanging by the hallway walls. The ridges in the corduroy have flattened over time, a visual companion to an unassuming rhyme. Leave the leather shoes, slide the cotton on, watch the shadows fade, wait upon the dawn. The chilling oak is neutralized beneath the woven soul, a quiet intervention keeping my foundation whole. I realize that loving is a cushion on the floor, a willingness to meet me on the inside of the door. You don't expect a rugged face when I am in the house. You cater to the quiet of a dedicated spouse. I shuffle to the kitchen and I turn the kettle on, protected from the temperatures that linger in the dawn. The house is a museum of the comfort you provide, a very private universe where I can safely hide. I pull my sweater closer and I lean against the frame, grateful for the refuge and the safety of your name. Walking on velvet, hiding from the bitter cold. Story of devotion that will never get too old. Nowhere to hide. The winter bite the arches on my feet. You insulate my journey in a quiet, soft retreat. The freezing wood is conquered by a pair of faded threads. I trust the steady comfort where my morning footprint treads. The floor is warm, the steps are quiet. I am home. A dog-eared little paperback resting on my knee, a quiet sort of journey meant for only you and me. I read the early chapters with a dedicated smile, believing we were settling to linger for a while. The characters were vibrant and the dialogue was real, a mirror for the heavy things we desperate tried to feel. I turned the pages over as the narrative advanced, to build my expectations on the promise of the plot, investing every fraction of the energy I got. But hitting chapter 20 brought a horrifying shock, a sudden interruption on the ticking of the clock. The final 20 pages were ripped out of the bind, leaving the conclusion and the closure far behind. A jagged edge of paper sitting right against the glue, quiet lack of answers ending my pursuit of you. Torn at the spine, leaving the ending in the dark, a cruel assassination of a complicated spark. I try to read the finish, but the sentences are gone. I am standing in the middle of a story pushing on. You cannot close a novel when the final page is dead. I stare at the remainder of the words we never said. Torn at the spine, leaving the ending in the dark, a cruel assassination of a complicated spark. I try to read the finish, but the sentences are gone. I am standing in the middle of a story pushing on. You cannot close a novel when the final page is dead. I stare at the remainder of the words we never said. Try to guess the outcome from the clues inside the text, to manufacture logic for whatever happened next. But guessing is a phantom that just tortures up the mind, a desperate endeavor for a traveler going blind. We built a heavy tension in the middle of the arc, and then you took the exit and abandoned me in dark. No quiet conversations to explain the reason why, just a sudden execution underneath a cloudy sky. Flip the empty page, trace the jagged tear, listen for the voice fading in the air. The mystery is permanent and closure is a ghost. I am severed from the ending that I wanted for the most. I realize that forcing an abandoned tale to close is begging for an answer that a weary heart forgoes. Love requires a period, a proper way to end, not a sudden vanishing of a dedicated friend. You ripped the resolution and you took it on the train, leaving me to navigate a solitary pain. I dropped the broken novel in the bottom of the bin, accepting the finale of the era we were in. I do not need an ending to acknowledge we are through. I close the heavy cover and I walk away from you. Torn at the spine, leaving the ending in the dark. Let it drop, a cruel assassination of a complicated spark. From the start, I tried to guess the finish, but the narrative was dead. I surrender the illusion and I clear my tired head. You cannot close a novel when the resolution flies. I walk into the avenue and whisper my goodbyes. The book is shut, the page is torn, I am done. plastic in the hand, resting on the metal tray, waiting for the planning of a complicated day. We used to uncap the color and write across the white, a flowing sort of logic in the middle of the night. The ink was a heavy black, erasing all the doubt, mapping our trajectory and laying safety out. But we got distracted by a sudden ringing phone, a tiny little error in a solitary zone. We left the marker naked on the bottom of the ledge, inviting the oxygen to dry the working edge. I picked it up this morning just to write a little note to capture an apology stuck deep inside my throat, but pressing on the surface only made a hollow squeak, a terrifying whisper that my weary heart would seek. The felt is rigid, pointing at the slick and glossy board, a casualty of maintenance we previously ignored. The dried felt scratching on the empty white space, a tragic intervention in a solitary place. I tried to draw a future but the moisture blew away, leaving just an echo of the words we meant to say. You cannot plan a journey when the ink turns into stone. I stare at the destruction while I navigate alone. Dried felt scratching on the empty white space, a tragic intervention in a solitary place. I tried to draw a future but the moisture blew away, leaving just an echo of the words we meant to say. You cannot plan a journey when the ink turns into stone. I stare at the destruction while I navigate alone. Tried to push the marker down to agitate the core, to squeeze a little liquid on the wiper by the door, but pressing rigid fabric only ruins the design. It flattens out the angle of a solitary line. We left the communication open to the bitter air, a casual neglect creating deep and dark despair. The board is standing empty, reflecting my mistake, a solitary lesson for my own exhausted sake. Scrape the heavy plastic, hear the empty sound, watch the failure happen on the silent ground. The color is evaporated, stolen by the heat. I am standing in the center of an undeniable defeat. I realize that loving is a very fragile tool. It requires the attention of a dedicated fool. If you leave the cap off and assume it stays intact, you forfeit the reality of undeniable fact. We starved the easy dialogue by leaving it exposed, and broke the very avenue that kept our spirits closed. I dropped the ruined cylinder into the plastic bin, accepting the finale of the era we were in. I turned my back to the whiteboard and I walked into the street, accepting the reality of this quiet, sad retreat. The dried felt scratching on the empty white space, a tragic intervention in a solitary place. I tried to draw a future but the moisture blew away. I leave the broken instrument and walk into the day. You cannot plan a journey when the ink turns into stone. I step out of the doorway and I navigate alone. The tip is dry, the board is blank. I am done. A little golden cylinder sitting on the window ledge, a tool to keep the sanity upon a narrow edge. The winter heat and turned the room into an aerospace. The dust was hanging heavy in the slanted morning ray, a million floating particles that wouldn't go away. I used to breathe the static in and feel my throat go dry, a choking sort of solitude beneath the quiet sky. My mind was just a hurricane of overthinking ash, a constant expectation of an undeniable crash. But you picked up the metal pump and gave the top a press, to mediate the panic and to mitigate the stress. A cloud of tiny water drops exploded in the light, a quiet intervention in the middle of the fight. The mist grabs onto every floating terror in the air and pulls them to the floorboard so I do not have to care. Settle in the dust, washing out the heavy quiet room. You don't just open windows and invite the freezing storm. You bring a gentle moisture just to keep my spirit warm. I choke upon the chaos in my mind. You spray a tiny miracle and leave the dust behind. Settle in the dust, washing out the heavy, quiet room. You don't just open windows and invite a freezing storm. You bring a gentle moisture just to keep my spirit warm. I don't have to choke up on the chaos in my mind. You spray a tiny miracle and leave the dust behind. People try to sweep the floor to conquer all the gray, but sweeping only throws the mess another kind of way. It kicks the trauma up where it enters in the lung, a toxic sort of anthem that the lonely ones have sung. But you apply the gravity with microscopic rain, a very quiet tactic that eliminates the pain. The brass is getting tarnished from the water and the touch, a testament to giving when the world demands too much. Push the silver thumb, watch the vapor fly, clean the heavy air underneath the sky. The particles descend and leave the oxygen so pure. I trust the brass intervention that is steady and secure. I realize that loving is an atmospheric grace, a willingness to purify a complicated space. You didn't ask to renovate the building or the walls, you manage the environment right before it falls. I take a deep inhalation and I feel the clean relief, a quiet separation from my overwhelming grief. The little brass container sits upon the wooden sill, a quiet reassurance of an undeniable will. I pull you by the shoulder and I rest against your chest, knowing you will always give my tired lungs a rest. Settle in the dust, pushing out the heavy quiet room. Safe and sound. You don't just open windows and invite the freezing storm. You spray a tiny miracle and keep my spirit warm. The air is finally breathable, the panic settles down. Trust your quiet magic in the center of the town. The mist clears, the dust drops, I am breathing. Yeah. Iron in the dirt. The wind would pull my shoulders in, throw me to my knees, a brutal demonstration of the power in the breeze. But you walked out carrying a mallet and a spike. You pulled the corner grommet and you drove the metal down, securing the perimeter outside the sleeping town. The fabric pulled in tension but the corner didn't lift, a quiet reassurance, a necessary gift. The storm attempts to tear the shelter from the muddy earth, but you provide an anchor for a quiet, steady birth. You do not try to reason with the hurricane and wind. You drive a piece of iron where the better days begin. I don't have to sacrifice my hands to hold the line. You stabilize the border and you make the safety mine. Ooh, yeah. Anchor in the fall, keeping down the flying sheet, a solid intervention for a runaway defeat. You do not try to reason with a hurricane or wind. You drive a piece of iron where the better days begin. I don't have to sacrifice my hands to hold the line. You stabilize the border and you make the safety mine. People try to buy a heavier and larger tent, ignoring the reality of money poorly spent. Because a massive canopy is nothing in a gale, if the foundation logic is an overwhelming fail. You prioritize the corner and the angle of the rope, a masterclass in cultivating necessary hope. The mallet hits the iron with the satisfying thud, a guarantee of safety in the center of the mud. Strike the heavy steel, push into the ground, keep the nylon tight, safe and quiet sound. The wind is pushing violently against the painted green, but we are in the safest place my eyes have ever seen. I realize the loving is a deep structural hold, a willingness to operate when nights are getting cold. You didn't ask to huddle in the middle of the space. You stood out in the weather just to fortify the base. I traced the muddy iron where it meets
against the yellow cord, appreciating what I had previously ignored. The tempest howls angrily, but can I break the pin? I zip the doorway shut and let the quiet hours in. I lay upon the sleeping bag and listen to the rain, protected from the memory of solitary pain. You do not try to reason with the hurricane or wind. You drive a piece of iron where the better days begin. The fabric holds the tension and the corners stay secure. I trust the heavy anger and the love I know is pure. The peg is set, the tent holds, I am warm.
Vintage piece of cowhide slung across my weary arm, a vessel meant to carry me and shield me from the harm. We used to pack it carefully with items we would need, a rational arrangement for a very quiet seed. The stitching held the leather in a tight and perfect line, a visual reminder of a boundary that was mine. But we began to overload the capacity it had, a desperate regression going fundamentally bad. We stuffed a heavy volume of expectations deep inside, leaving absolutely nowhere for the quiet things to hide. The pressure pushed the leather till the stitches began to groan, a terrifying sound inside a solitary zone. I picked it up this morning and the bottom gave away, a quiet execution in the middle of the day. The thread surrenders finally to a terrifying tear, spilling all the contents in the cold and open air. Tearing the seams, splitting up the heavy brown base. I try to hold the bottom, but the contents slip away. A miserable portrait of an ordinary day. You cannot force a vessel to carry what it can't. I stare at the destruction on the solitary place. Tearing the seams, splitting up the heavy brown base. A tragic little failure in a complicated place. I try to hold the bottom, but the contents slip away. A miserable portrait of an ordinary day. You cannot force a vessel to carry what it can. I stare at the destruction on the solitary plan. Tried to gather up the books and push them back inside, to orchestrate a rescue of a highly wounded pride. But putting heavy items in a bag without a floor is volunteering for the pain a dozen times or more. We forced an ugly pressure on the delicate design, ignoring the fragility of your tired heart and mind. The cowhide flaps open like an agonizing wound, a casualty of arrogance perfectly marooned. Drop the heavy books, watch the leather rip, fail to hold the weight on the sinking ship. The bag is compromised and the carrying is done. I am standing in the wreckage, looking at the sun. I realize the force and ineffection to expand is begging for a tragedy you cannot understand. Love requires a limit to the burden it will bear, not an overwhelming packing in the center of the square. We ruin the foundation by demanding it to stretch and shatter the perimeter of an optimistic catch. I kick the broken leather to the gutter by the drain, accepting the reality of solitary pain. I pick up what is necessary, leaving all the rest. I walk into the avenue and put it to the test. Splitting up the heavy brown base, a tragic little failure in a complicated place. I tried to hold the bottom, but the thread began to break. I surrendered the illusion for my own exhausted state. You cannot force a vessel to carry what it can. I leave the ruined leather and I walk the quiet slant. The bag is torn, the load is dry, I am gone. A tiny spark of copper-driven yellow pine to guarantee the safety of an intricate design. I held the heavy hammer with an arrogant tight grip. I wanted to secure the board and make the joining fast, to force a rapid future that was engineered to last. But copper is a soft metal yielding to the strike, a vulnerable traveler on a very hike. I brought the iron downward with an unexpected force, knocking the trajectory completely off its course. The flathead took the impact and sheared completely off, a microscopic tragedy producing a quiet scoff. The shaft is buried deeply in the center of the grain, leaving me with nothing but a solitary pain. The anchor is decapitated, trapped inside the wood. I cannot pull it backward from the places where we stood. Stripped to the head, locked inside a heavy wooden block, a devastating consequence, a terrifying shock. I try to grab the cylinder, but pliers cannot bite. I ruin the connection in the middle of the night. You cannot fix a union when the interface is gone. I stare at the disaster and I cannot carry on. Stripped to the head, locked inside a heavy wooden block, a devastating consequence, a terrifying shock. I try to grab the cylinder, but pliers cannot bite. I ruin the connection in the middle of the night. You cannot fix a union when the interface is gone. I stare at the disaster and I cannot carry on. I tried to dig a crater just to access the remains, to mitigate the panic running deep inside my veins. But digging in the timber leaves a jagged, ugly scar, a visual translation of exactly who we are. We swung the heavy hammer trying to demand the tide, ignoring the fragility underneath the open sky. The nail is just a prisoner devoid of any use, a permanent remainder of a quiet, slow abuse. Hit the fragile brass, watch the metal fly, fail to make the joint, watch the meaning die. The head is lying useless on the dusty wooden floor. I cannot pull the anchor from the timber anymore. I realize that forcing an affection into place is volunteering to destroy a very sacred space. Love requires a gentle and a calibrated tap, not a brutal hammering upon a fragile map. We broke the vital instrument by rushing up the blow and trapped ourselves entirely with nowhere left to go. I set the heavy hammer down and walk away from grief, accepting the arrival of an agonizing relief. The board is sitting crooked, unfixable and sad. I turn away from fighting for the history we had. Stripped of the head, locked inside a heavy wooden block, the devastating consequence, I did my best. I tried to pull the cylinder, but leverage had to fail. I surrendered the illusion of a complicated tale. You cannot fix a union when the interface is gone. I leave the broken timber and I quietly move on. The nail is broke, the wood is scarred, I am done. A pair of golden scissors resting on the wooden tray. I used to let the candle burn without a second thought, ignoring all the smoke and messy edges that I got. The fire would grow out and flicker in an angry tone, a suffocating habit I was practicing alone. The room was getting hazy from the carbon in the air, a thick and bitter smog wrapping around the reading chair. But you picked up the metal tool and reached into the jar to clean the dirty engine of exactly who we are. You snipped the blackened cotton right across the frayed design and pulled the toxic ash away to save this light of mine. The flame settles down into a focused, steady glow. You take away the damage and you give me room to grow. Trimming the ash, cutting the bitter edge away, a quiet intervention at the closing of the day. You don't just let me burn until the room is turning black. You clip the ruined thread and pull the honest fire back. I don't have to choke on all the errors of my past. You tend the little ember and you make the magic last. Yeah. Trimming the ash, cutting the bitter edge away, a quiet intervention at the close light the wick and look away until it dies. A lazy sort of romance hiding underneath the lies. But tending to a fire is a dedicated art, a willingness to trim the bad intentions from the heart. The little tray catches all the dark and ruined thread, a visual reminder of the better path ahead. I watch the golden orb pushing out the evening gray, a warm and healthy oxygen replacing the decay. Clip the burn cotton, catch the falling dust. Ooh, keep the fire burning, build a quiet trust. The glass is turning clear and the breathing is so deep. I trust the breath's precision for the promises we keep. I realize the loving is a maintenance routine, a gentle sort of pruning, keeping my intentions clean. You didn't ask to put the fire out or leave the room. You simply took the instrument and managed all the gloom. I traced the golden handle resting softly by the book, appreciating the deliberate and patient path we took. The candlelight is shining on the surface of your face, a masterpiece of comfort in an ordinary place. I let my shoulders drop and breathe the purified warm air, knowing that your quiet dedication is right there. Trimming the ash, cutting the bitter edge away. Safe and a quiet intervention at the closing of the day. On the ground, you don't just let me burn till the oxygen is gone. You prune the toxic habits and you help me carry on. The flame is burning, brilliant and the atmosphere is clear. I trust the steady scissors, holding back my every fear. The ash is gone, the light is bright, I am home.
Flat piece of canvas with a woven double strap. I used to carry firewood stacked against my open chest. The bark would leave a splinter and a tear upon my shirt, a daily installation of an unavoidable hurt. My arms were always aching from the awkward heavy load, a clumsy sort of juggle on a dark and icy road. But you brought out the fabric and you laid it on the ground, a quiet intervention without any warning sound. You stacked the jagged oak inside the center of the sheet and wrapped the edges up to make the carrying complete. The fabric holds the rough and broken edges from my skin, a tactical defense where all the better days begin. The handles pull together, taking all the rigid weight. You balance out the burden of my complicated fate. Bearing the timber, wrapping up the jagged edge, a rugged sort of comfort pulling back from the ledge. You don't erase the winter or the fuel I have to drag. You slide my heavy worries in a sturdy cotton bag. I don't have to bleed against the rough and dirty pine. You carry all the splinters and you make the safety mine. Bearing the timber, wrapping up the jagged edge, a rugged sort of comfort pulling back from the ledge. Don't erase the winter or the fuel I have to drag. You slide my heavy worries in a sturdy cotton bag. I don't have to bleed against the rough and dirty pine. You carry all the splinters and you make the safety mine. Try to face the cold by walking bare and brave, marching down a path into a solitary grave. But carrying a burden takes a functional design. The canvas shows the dirt and ash from working in the freeze, a diary of keeping me from falling to my knees. I grab the woven handle and I pull the cargo high, protected from the damage underneath the evening sky. Wrap the rough wood, pull the straps tight, walk the frozen path in the fading light. The splinters stay contained inside the center of the fold. The quiet masterpiece, defending me against the cold. I realize that loving is a heavy lifting chore, a willingness to carry what is waiting by the door. You didn't ask to sit beside the fire taking heat. You walked into the weather on the unforgiving street. We bring a load of timber right across the living room and feed the roaring stove to chase away the winter gloom. I wipe the dirty canvas and I fold it on the chair, grateful for the labor you are willing to bear. The room is getting warmer and my hands are free of pain. I trust the heavy cotton in the freezing icy rain. There in the timber, wrapping up the jagged edge, slave inside, rugged sort of comfort, pulling back from the ledge. Nowhere to hide, don't erase the winter or the fuel I have to drag. You shield my tired body with the sturdy cotton bag. The fire burns in safety and the rough debris is gone. I hold your quiet hand and find the strength to carry on. The wood is stacked, the hands are safe, I am warm.
Stone on the clay, a heavy white ceramic bowl sitting on the block, a tool designed to navigate a complicated shock. We threw the bitter seeds of doubt into the hollow base, hoping we could ground them in this isolated space. I took the heavy pestle and I drove it in the dust, trying to pulverize the anger and the broken trust. But pounding out a problem takes a calculated hand, the delicate momentum I refuse to understand. I forced the heavy timber down with an aggressive strike, a violent navigation on a terrifying height. The ceramic took the impact but it couldn't hold the strain. A microscopic yielding to an overwhelming pain. A jagged line appeared across the bottom of the white, a physical translation of the closing of the night. The structure is compromised by pushing far too hard. I stand observing the disaster written on the card. Fraction mortar breaking from a heavy, angry blow, a devastating signal letting my intentions go. I try to grind the trouble but the vessel falls apart, a tragic illustration of a heavy ruined heart. You cannot crush a sorrow when the boundary is destroyed. I stare at the disaster in an isolated void. Fracture mortar breaking from a heavy, angry blow, a devastating signal letting my intentions go. I try to grind the trouble but the vessel falls apart, the tragic illustration of a heavy ruined heart. You cannot crush a sorrow when the boundary is destroyed. I stare at the disaster in an isolated void. I tried to push the edges back to seal the gaping crack, to orchestrate a rescue on a highly damaged track, but broken clay refuses to contain the heavy dust. It spills the bitter powder through the center of the truss. We took a fragile vessel and we treated it like steel, ignoring all the delicate and quiet things we feel. The mortar is a casualty of arrogant demand, a tragedy my weary spirit has to understand. Strike the bottom hard, watch the ceramic yield, spill the bitter seed on the broken field. The crushing only work to tear the foundation down. I'm standing in the center of an empty town. I realize that forcing an extraction from the pain is guaranteeing failure in the middle of the rain. Love requires a vessel that is treated with respect, not a brutal hammering of arrogant neglect. We smashed the white perimeter by asking for too much and ruined the capacity of any gentle touch. I dropped the wooden pestle on the table by the sink, accepting the reality of dire thoughts. I think I sweep the broken ceramic to the bottom of the trash and walk away from the illusion turning into ash. Fracture mortar breaking from a heavy, angry blow. Let it draw, a devastating signal, letting my intentions go. Time to stop. I tried to grind the trouble, but the boundary had to break. I surrendered the illusion for my own exhausted sake. You cannot crush a sorrow when the foundation is destroyed. I turn my collar upward and I step into the void. The bowl is split, the powder spills. I am done. Yeah. Yeah. But trying to articulate an ending to a fight requires a delicate and very careful kind of sight. I press the heavy buttons with a frustrated demand, striking the machinery. The metal ever jammed against the center of the ink, a violent interruption to the tired thoughts I think. The arm snapped in the middle and tumbled to the base, a permanent omission in a highly vocal space. The letter is deleted from the vocabulary known. I am forced to type a story, walking quiet and alone. I try to type the word, but the mechanism fails, leaving blank spaces on these complicated trails. You cannot write a future when the alphabet is torn. I stare at the destruction in a solitary morn. I try the word, but the mechanism fails, leaving blank spaces on these complicated trails. You cannot write a future when the alphabet is torn. I stare at the destruction in a solitary morn. I tried to push the metal back and glue it to the stem to orchestrate a rescue of a highly broken gem. But typing requires tension that a fractured arm can't take. A miserable compromise for my exhausted sake. We hit the keys too hard, trying to force the story out, and broke the very instrument we care so much about. The page is full of gaps where the meaning used to sit, a visual translation of the ending I admit. Hit the broken key, watch the hammer miss, fail to type the truth in the final kiss. The silence on the paper is a loud and heavy shout. I am walking from the narrative we tried to figure out. I realized that forcing a connection on the page is a devastating habit of an optimistic age. Love requires a gentle touch to let the story flow, not the brutal hammering to manage what you know. We broke the vital alphabet by rushing up the pace and locked ourselves entirely out of the sacred space. I pulled the paper sheet from the roller of the drum, accepting the reality of what we have become. I leave the broken typewriter gathering the dust and walk into the avenue, abandoning the trust. The missing letters, let it drop, let it drop. I try to type the word, time to stop. I try to type the word, but the mechanism died. I surrendered the illusion to the weary rising tide. You cannot write a future when the alphabet is torn. I leave the broken instrument and navigate the morn. The key is blank, the text is gone, I'm leaving. I try to read the chapters in the middle of the breeze. The paper fluttered wildly and flipped the spine, losing all the focus on the sentences of mine. I used to try to hold the pages open with my hand. At first frustrating endeavor I could hardly understand. My fingers would grow tired from the unrelenting strain, a microscopic battle in the middle of the rain. But you walked up and placed the heavy leather on the seam, a practical solution to an interrupted dream. The weight sat on the paper and flattened out the curve, a physical devotion that my weary days observe. The wind attempts to scramble all the meaning in the text, but you secure the present and whatever happens next. Keeping the page, anchoring the story in the light. You don't erase the weather or demand the wind to stop. You simply lay a burden where the restless pages drop. I do not have to struggle to remember where I am. You hold the heavy paper and alleviate the jam. Keeping the page, anchoring the story in the light. You don't erase the weather or demand the wind to stop. Oh, you simply lay a burden where the restless pages drop. I do not have to struggle to remember where I am. You hold the heavy paper and alleviate the jam. People try to read inside a vacuum-sealed room, afraid of any breeze that might eradicate the gloom. But closing all the windows makes the oxygen go dead. It suffocates the magic of the quiet words we said. You let the air rush inward and rattle up the blinds, knowing that the leather leaves the panic far behind. The stitched edge holds the margin with a very steady grace, a masterpiece of comfort in an ordinary place. Rest the heavy hide, stop the flippant sheet, read the honest line, quiet the defeat. The story stays in focus and the narrative is clear. I trust the quiet safety that is waiting for me here. I realize that loving is a weighted sort of rest, a willingness to tolerate the fluttering and test. You didn't ask to close the book and walk out of the door. You simply gave me focus I had never known before. I read the final paragraph and slide the letter down, protected from the chaos of this unpredictable town. The wind is howling loudly, but the chapter is secure, a testament to a devotion absolute and pure. I close the heavy cover and I look into your eyes, protected from the panic of the unexpected skies. Keeping the page, anchoring the story in the light. Safe and don't erase the weather or demand the wind to stop. You place a quiet anchor where the restless pages drop. The narrative is steady and the confusion fades away. I trust your quiet guidance as I wake to face the day. The wind blows, the pages still I am reading.
A black elastic cable hooked onto a metal ring. Got rigid lines are victims of a sudden heavy gust. They snap without a warning and eradicate the trust. The canvas would be tearing at the corner of the seam, a terrifying ending to a complicated dream. But you brought out the bungee and you hooked it to the base, a flexible addition to a vulnerable place. The wind came howling downward from the center of the peak, a violent intervention that my weary heart would seek. The fabric pulls away, but the rubber gives it room, absorbing all the panic and eradicating gloom. You don't resist the weather with the stubborn, angry fight. You stretch to hold the canvas in the middle of the night. I do not have to worry that the shelter tears apart. You offer a resilient and understanding heart. You don't resist the weather with the stubborn, angry fight. You stretch to hold the canvas in the middle of the night. I do not have to worry that the shelter tears apart. You offer a resilient and understanding heart. People try to stand their ground and never learn to bend, a recipe for breaking at the coming of the end. But survival is a science of accommodating stress. The rubber cord is stretching till it reaches to the max, a visual reminder of the rigidness it lacks. The wind subsides a little and the cable pulls it back, a subtle sort of magic on a solitary track. Stretch with the wind, let the nylon pull, snap right back in place, keep the shelter full. The storm is unpredictable and screaming in the dark, but we are insulated by a flexible. I realize that loving is a willingness to yield, a flexible devotion on a terrifying field. You didn't ask to build a wall of concrete and of stone. You offered an elastic that I could call my own. I lie upon the sleeping bag and watch the fabric sway, a graceful sort of dancing at the fading of the day. The storm is blowing sideways, but the interior is dry. I trust the simple rubber underneath the angry sky. I close my tired eyelids and I let the tempest roar, protected by the tension, anchored to the muddy floor. You don't resist the weather with the stubborn, angry fight. No way. You stretch to hold the canvas in the middle of the night. The wind is pushing hard, but the boundary is secure. I trust the quiet rubber, and the love I know is pure.
Square of woven flannel just to bring the leather shine, to polish up the surfaces of your life and mine. The fabric was a bright and optimistic shade of white, but polishing requires the absorption of the dirt. But polishing requires the absorption of the dirt, a steady accumulation of the solitary hurt. The wax began to build upon the center of the weave. I picked it up, I picked it up this morning just to clean an autumn scuff, to try to prove the magic was resilient and tough. But dragging dirty flannel only leaves a cloudy smear, a visual translation of the ending drawing near. The fabric is exhausted by the wax it had to take. I stare at the disaster my tired hands would make. I try to bring the luster back, but the fabric is destroyed, leaving a dark shadow in an isolated void. You cannot force a shine when the instrument is dead. I stare at the distortion of the bitter words we said. I try to bring the luster back, but the fabric is destroyed, leaving a dark shadow in an isolated fabricated void you cannot force to shine. When the instrument is dead, I stare at the distortion of the bitter words we said. I tried to wash the flannel in a sink of boiling rain, to orchestrate a rescue of the solitary pain. But wax that enters cotton becomes a permanent decree, an ugly sort of shadow sitting right on top of me. We thought our steady effort would eradicate the flaw, a desperate avoidance of an undeniable law. But cleaning up a symptom means you have to hold the mess, a quiet sort of drowning in a suffocating stress. Rub the dirty cloth, watch the leather fade, fail to find the spark in the choices made. The fabric is a burden and the shine is turning dull. I walk away completely from the vessel standing full. I realize that forcing an exhausted, broken rag is volunteering for a highly solitary drag. Love requires a medium that is ready to renew, not a dirty rectangle that obscures the honest view. We ruined the foundation by ignoring all the signs, and trapped ourselves entirely in complicated lines. I dropped the ruined flannel in the garbage by the door, accepting I won't polish up the leather anymore. The shoe is sitting cloudy, unfixable and sad. I turn my collar upward and abandon what we had. I try to bring the luster, but the fabric was destroyed. I surrender the illusion to the solitary void you cannot force to shine. When the instrument is dead, I step out of the doorway and I clear my tired head. The cloth is dirty, the shine is gone, I am done. A canopy of black material held by silver bone, a portable protector in a solitary zone. I press the metal buckles when the lightest breezes blow, a terrifying whisper of the things I didn't know. We faced a heavy hurricane with the fabricated shield, and watched the silver skeleton fundamentally yield. The rain is hitting heavy on the fabric of my coat, a miserable traveler on a sinking heavy boat. Pull the broken wire, watch the nylon tear, fail to find shelter in the freezing air. The structure is a hazard and the protection's a lie. I am standing in the wreckage looking at the open sky. I realize that forcing an affection to survive is begging for a tragedy you cannot keep alive. Love requires a flexibility to ride the sudden gusts, not a rigid opposition that will crumble into dust. We broke the vital instrument by asking for too much and ruined the capacity of any gentle touch. I dropped the broken canopy into the metal trash, accepting that the history is turned to silent ash. I stand without a barrier beneath the pouring rain and walk into the avenue, stepping out of pain. Snapped in the wind, breaking in the middle of the street. I try to pull the metal, but the hinges had to break. I try to pull the metal, but the hinges had to break. I surrender the illusion for my own exhausted sake. You cannot walk a journey when the canopy is dead. I leave the broken instrument and clear my tired head. small frame of timber resting in the kitchen space. I try to reach the boxes on the highest upper shelf. My fingertips will brush against the bottom of the board, missing all the items that I desperately adored. I used to stand on tiptoes till my ankle started burning, a frustrating habit and a very empty yearning. I dropped the glass container trying hard to make the stretch, a miserable failure on a miserable catch. But you brought in a stool made of solid sanded oak, easing all the tension before I even spoke. You slid it on the towel right beneath my floating feet, offering a sturdy end to my routine defeat. The wood absorbs my weight and brings the upper shelf in view, a simple piece of magic leaning heavily on you. The wooden step lifting on my tired frame. You do not judge the distance that my hands can never close. You offer a foundation where the endless shadow grows. I don't have to jump and fall upon the kitchen ground. You give my aching bones the finest shelter to be found. The wooden scale lifting up my tired frame, a steady intervention in a losing weary game. You do not judge the distance that my hands could never close. You offer a foundation where the endless shadow grows. I don't have to jump and fall upon the kitchen ground. You give my aching bones the finest shelter to be found. People mock the need for finding help to reach the top. Arrogance that forces everywhere, very hard to stop. But independence often is an isolating pride, a freezing empty corridor where broken spirits hide. The step stool bears the scuff marks from the rubber of my shoe, a tactile little diary leading straight to you. I step onto the grain and I look across the room, eradicating every trace of overthinking doom. Rest the tired feet, step upon the wood, reach the highest shelf, standing where we stood. The timber takes the burden and the elevation holds. I watch the honest and everything unfolds. I realize that loving is an elevating lift, the practical solution in an undeniable gift. You didn't ask to take the things I wanted for your own. You gave me the capacity to pull them down alone. I step off the oak and I set the glass aside, swallowing the remnants of my isolating pride. Your kitchen is a haven, now the frantic jumping ends. I lean against the counter with the truest of my friends. I tap the wooden surface with the bottom of my shoe, grateful for the altitude I always find in you. The wooden step lifting on my tired frame. You do not judge the distance that my hands could never close. You offer a foundation where the endless shadow grows. The stretching is defeated and the shelf is in my grip. I trust your sturdy anchor on this unpredictable ship. The wood is firm, the reach is easy, I am home. Rubber on the floor. A black strip of rubber running straight across the room, hiding vulnerable power from an accidental doom. The audio connections used to snake across the tiles. People walked across the floor and stepped upon the cord. The lines began to fray. The lines began to fray and drop the signals in the dark, a terrifying interruption to the vital spark. I tried to tape the copper down and minimize the hit, a desperate maneuver that refused to just commit. But you laid down the heavy mat and covered up the seam, protecting the mechanics of a complicated dream. The yellow caution stripes warn the strangers on their feet, a visual defense against a miserable defeat. The boots hit the rubber but the fragile lines survive. You shield the deepest currents and keep the sound alive, guarding the wire, taking on the heavy tread, a physical protection for the honest words we said. You don't just let the busy world trample on my mind. You lay a thick perimeter and leave the
inside my heart. Caught in the wire, taking on a heavy tread, a physical protection for the honest words we said. You don't just let the busy world trample on my mind. You lay a thick perimeter and leave the risk behind. I do not have to worry that the connection breaks apart. You insulate the signals running deep inside my heart. Touch the sturdy casing with the toe of my own shoe and recognize the labor I attribute back to you. People leave the nerves exposed and wonder why they bleed, refusing to acknowledge an undeniable need. But you respect the delicacy hiding in the core and run the heavy rubber straight across the studio floor. The music plays without a drop of static in the sound, a masterpiece of working with both feet upon the crown. Step on the rubber, spare the fragile line. Trust the yellow stripes, make the safety mine. The boots can walk in circles, but the audio is clear. I rely on the protection that you established here. I realize that loving is a shielding of the vein, a willingness to tolerate the footsteps and the rain. You didn't ask to rearrange the wiring in my head. You offered a defense for where the fragile signals led. I look across the studio and hear the steady beat, a flawless execution on a very noisy street. The crowd is moving fast but my interior is fine. I trust the heavy rubber that covers up my line. I pick the microphone and let my honest voice be heard, grateful for the armor surrounding every word. Caught in the wire, taking on the heavy tread, safe inside, a physical protection for the honest words we said. No way, you don't just let the busy world trample on my mind. You lay a thick perimeter and leave the risk behind. The signal runs pure and the panic fades away. I trust your quiet armor as I wake to face the day. The cable holds, the sound is true, I am safe.
A metal post standing on the edge of the street, a mechanical witness to a bitter defeat. The dome of faded glass shows a tiny little dial. I park my tired engine in the designated space, hoping to secure a very temporary grace. I dug into my pocket for a heavy silver coin, a desperate endeavor for the life I tried to join. I dropped the quarter down into the rusted little slide, expecting an extension of the time we barely got. But twisting down the handle didn't move the needle right, a paralyzing error in the middle of the night. The window shows a piece of metal painted rigid red, a visual translation of the bitter words we said. The currency falls empty in the belly of the base. I cannot buy a future in this isolated place. The red flag sitting in the center of the glass, a devastating signal that the hours wouldn't pass. I try to feed the meter but the mechanism dies, leaving me exhausted underneath the open skies. You cannot pause a ticking when the instrument is dead. I stare at the expiration, taking over my head. The red flag sitting in the center of the glass, a devastating signal that the hours wouldn't pass. I try to feed the meter but the mechanism dies, leaving me exhausted underneath the open skies. You cannot pause a ticking when the instrument is dead. I stare at the expiration, taking over my head. I try to drop a dime to see a smaller metal work, but frantic navigation where the heavy shadows lurk. But throwing away effort on a broken iron shell is volunteering entrance to a voluntary hell. We poured our conversation in a disconnected void, expecting a return on a foundation so destroyed. The red sign never wavers glaring through the dirty clear, a harsh and sudden rendering a solitary fear. Drop the silver down, turn the heavy knob, watch the needle fail. It rejects the job. The time is officially depleted on the track. Oh, and walking from the corner, never coming back. I realize that forcing an investment on the loss is too choosing to be burdened by a terrifying cross. Love requires an engine that registers the care, not a broken meter in the freezing winter air. We pushed our expectations in a highly flawed machine, the saddest demolition that my tired eyes have seen. I leave the empty coins resting useless in the dark, accepting the finale of a suffocated spark. I turn the engine over and I pull into the lane. I walk away from pouring my affection down the drain. The red flag sitting in the center of the glass, let it dry, stayed and signal that the hours wouldn't pass. Time to stop, feed the meter, but the timer had to break. I surrendered the illusion for my own exhausted sake. You cannot buy a future when the instrument is dead. I leave the broken metal and I clear my tired head. The time is up, the point is lost. I am driving. Rubber on the glass, a strip of black rubber stretching on a metal arm, a mechanism meant to keep the driver safe from harm. The rain is coming heavy on the center of the shield. I flip the plastic lever just to push the storm away, to resurrect the clarity and navigate the day. But the sun had baked the rubber in the middle of July, leaving dry and brittle edges underneath the sky. The blade drags slow and jagged on the surface of the pain. It didn't clear the water, it just rearranged the rain. A dirty foggy smear extending right across my view, a physical translation of the mess with me and you. I squint against the headlight shining blurry in the dark, a terrifying ending to a suffocated spark. The motion makes the visibility a muddy toxic gray. I cannot see the road because the tool is in the way. The ruined blade smearing all the water on the glass, a devastating curtain watching blurry shadows pass. I try to wipe the sorrow, but the rubber leaves a stain, a miserable tactic in an unrelenting rain. You cannot clear a future with an instrument so flawed. I stare at the distortion that my weary hands ignored. The ruined blade smearing all the water on the glass, a devastating curtain watching blurry shadows pass. I try to wipe the sorrow, but the rubber leaves a stain, a miserable tactic in an unrelenting rain. You cannot clear a future with an instrument so flawed. I stare at the destruction that my weary hands ignored. I tried to run the fluid just to wash the dirty streak, to artificially create the clarity I seek. But adding soapy water to a deeply broken line only clouds the geometry of your life and mine. We forced the conversation, trying desperately to mend, but every word we offered only hastened up the end. The back and forth is toxic and the friction is a crime, a waste of raw emotion and an unforgiving time. Drag the heavy rubber, smear the freezing rain, fail to see the highway drown inside the pain. The effort makes the blindness an impenetrable wall. I take my foot away and let the consequences fall. I realize that fixing the connection that is dead is mixing up the poison in the bitter words we said. Love requires clarity and not a broken wiper dragging mud across my face. We try to heal the damage, but the method was destroyed, leaving us to navigate a terrifying void. I pull the car aside and turn the frantic engine down, accepting the reality in this abandoned town. I leave the keys inside and walk into the open storm. I do not need the shelter if it cannot keep me warm. The ruined blade smearing all the water on the glass, let it drop, a devastating curtain watching blurry shadows pass. Time to stop. I try to wipe the sorrow, but the friction left a stain. I surrender the illusion to the isolating rain. You cannot clear a future with with an instrument so flawed. I walk into the avenue and leave the broken chord. The view is blurred. The car is still, I am walking.